Hi, welcome back to Environmental Law. We are here at week two, and week two, we are going to cover history of environmental law, standing, and then start just talking generally about administrative agencies in general. So let's go. This is kind of the fun stuff, the history of the environmental law. Okay, so in our country, we go back to the 1900s. Before the 1900s, we were worried about settling land, our manifest destiny, etc. So, Teddy Roosevelt, who is pictured here on this slide with the Sierra Club founder, John Muir at Yosemite. So, he loved the outdoors. He didn't really care about maybe preserving resources. He was a hunter and things like that, so he gets a hard time about that now. But what he did do, he did care about people being outside, enjoying the outdoors, and preserving lands against future development. So he basically created our public land system, which creates national forests and national parks, which is pretty big. So right now, he set aside 230 million acres of our country as public lands. So, and some of those were set up as national parks and national forests. He also cared about bird sanctuaries and concerned with like future generations being able to see and use these lands. So that's Teddy and John Muir in Yosemite in 1903. So that's like super duper old. So it was more about just like, oh, we want some parkland. We want people to be able to hike and enjoy the outdoors. But, from the 1900s, our country became very industrialized. And with industrialism becomes pollution. So in 1953, a public interest group called Keep America Beautiful was formed to kind of start an anti-litter campaign because things were gross, and I'll show you in a minute. Like even when I was growing up, when you were out on a highway and you had something that you didn't want anymore, like a can or a lot of people with cigarettes, just throw it out the window. That was like the garbage can. It was kind of, and it wasn't frowned upon at all. And I did it myself. You didn't even think about it. And you'll see in a second, Keep America Beautiful did a lot to change just the general litter mentality. I mean, now if you see somebody throwing something on the ground, any of us, we would be like, "Excuse me, you dropped that," or you would go and pick it up. Like people don't do that anymore. Um, so a little later, after Keep America Beautiful, but Keep America Beautiful didn't become super important until a little bit later. Um, a biologist named Rachel Carson started noticing that after pesticides like DDT, and we're going to talk about that when we go into our pesticide chapter, were applied, and pesticides were thought as like miracle chemicals um, because they stopped pests on crops, and then things like mosquitoes. There's all this mosquito airborne illness, and and it stopped that, or it really greatly reduced that. So they were thought as like such a miracle. But Rachel Carson, was her job, she was a biologist, her job was of observing nature, and she observed how the environment, how plant life, how animal life was affected after the application of these pesticides. And she wrote a book, and I put the PDF, I posted that for you to look at. It's really, I mean, I've just read the intro of it. Um, it's really, really well done because it's very simple language. And she just talks about, how it was before and how it is now. And, we kind of have to do something about that. Um, okay, so this is Keep America Beautiful. And I'm going to have you, when I'm done with my lecture, go back and watch this if you haven't seen it already, and don't just skip this. If I put it on now, it's going to be hard for it's going to be not great quality, but if you go on YouTube yourself to um, watch it. It's this the Native American man starting from his country area and getting in a canoe and riding towards the city and seeing pollution and litter and being so upset about it. And it really like hit home. I mean, everyone growing up in that era remembers this commercial, and it changed people's minds. And it's like, what, the end, you see somebody throw some trash out their car window and it hits him in the foot, and you see a teardrop from his eye. And the myth of Native American men is that they don't cry, right? And um so that's why it's called the Crying Indian. No, I guess it's a spoiler alert, but that's the punchline. And people started to change their behavior really um, from watching this commercial, because people used to watch commercial TV back then too, and seeing these posters and the public service announcements over there in 1971. So really, don't skip it. Come back and watch that, and I'll remind you at the end of this part of the lecture. So okay, so we have Rachel Carson, we have um, Keep America Beautiful, and then there is this court decision, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we go into standing this week. But Scenic Hudson was a very, very long legal dispute where Con Ed, which is New York's version of ComEd, they were going to build a very large hydroelectric plant. So, like dam related, right? Into right near Storm King Mountain on the Hudson in Cornwall, New York. And a concerned citizen group filed a lawsuit to stop this. So it's the beginning, because at that point in 1963, we didn't have our environmental statutes. So they did it based on, common law. And there's a lot of important precedents, important firsts in the Scenic Hudson decision. One, it established the right of individual citizens to initiate and participate in environmental disputes and advocate their position. Environmental law was never ever thought of as an area of law before, and this was the beginning of that. And then it also, Congress is looking what's going on, and it inspired them to enact our first environmental law, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And really, it kind of launched our modern environmental movement. And this is the Hudson River here, Cornwall, New York. I don't know if you guys have ever been in New York, but West Point is just south of it. So if you're at West Point, you can go, and then you can still go hiking in this Storm King Mountain. They called it the Storm King because it doesn't really look like a mountain, it looks like a hill, but it was a mountain. And so because it was high up, you would see the clouds form at the top of the mountain before you would notice them further down before it got foggy. I guess we're going to talk about it now. I guess we are talking about it now. Are we talking about it now? Let me see. I guess we are. Okay. Before we're starting to talk about standing, but it is standing. Okay, so the parties, there is a proposed hydroelectric plant, right? An electric plant powered by water. And the Federal Power Commission is the federal agency that approved it. So there's two issues. And one is, did this Federal Power Commission do its best job to develop the waterway under the Federal Power Act? And then the other issue is, did plaintiffs have what we call standing under the Federal Power Act to dispute the decision? Okay, yeah, we're actually that we're talking more about that in standing. That slide is probably misplaced. So sorry about that. Um, not in my history section. Okay, so environmental law. Any discussion of environmental law or class on environmental law, you will notice that there are two competing sides or mindsets. Okay, so you have this pro business, pro interest industry, and growth is good. Anything building, manufacturing is great as long as business and economics prosper. Okay, that's the and they don't want governmental interference with their ability to make or build. Okay, and then you have the other side, which my environmental law professor in law school used to call the greenies. The greenies. He had a funny voice. Ernie, I can't even remember his name right now. Ernie was his name. So maybe anti-business, but pro-environment and pro-regulations uh, to protect the environment. So constantly, you'll have that like, oh, we really, really want this factory, but what happens with this factory? Do we have air pollution? Do we have water pollution? Do we have any toxic waste we have to worry about? So it's the age old struggle, and what the laws and the government try to do is balance environmental accountability and the needs of our long-term earthly needs with the ability of businesses to operate. Okay, so this goes on and on and on and on. Okay, so we had what did we go through? We had Rachel Carson, we had the Crying Indian, we had Scenic Hudson. And so because of these things, now all of a sudden in the late 60s, people are like, wait, I don't like litter. I don't like dirt. I don't like dirty rivers. Um, the, what's it called? The river in Cleveland like went on fire because of like oil on it. It was like the rivers were terrible, terrible. The water was terrible. We'll talk about it when we did the Clean Water Act. So your everyday people started really realizing that like we can't and shouldn't live this way. So in 1970, Nixon, who was very much vilified but did a lot for the environment, he consolidated all these different agency responsibilities into one agency called the EPA, the Environmental Protection EPA. People thought it was just going to be uh, window dressing and nothing actually happening. But one of the things that the EPA started with was these pesticides, that Rachel Carson brought into the public knowledge. So one of the early things that the EPA did was investigating pesticides, specifically the pesticide DDT, and learned that it was carcinogenic, and ultimately issued a ban on DDT, and DDT is no longer made in the United States. So, and then chemical companies tried to defeat that ban on DDT to keep making it, but it's successfully defended lawsuits against the ban. So that's the 1970s. The EPA is created. There's a bunch of, oh, here's another one. This is the, what's right versus what's easy. This is this environmental defense fund versus the EPA. You would think that the Environmental Defense Fund would like the ban of DDT, but they thought the ban should have gone further and done more. So the EPA, as we're talking about this balancing act, it often finds itself on nobody's good side. One side might think they're doing not too much, and the other side might think they're doing not enough. So that is that. Okay, so we're continuing at the 70s. It's really, really the most prolific decade the kind of the really the most things happened in environmental law that had happened in our history in the 1970s. Um, so EPA's created the National Environmental Policy Act. When we start a few weeks in, when we start talking about the specific statutes, we'll talk about NEPA. Um, environmental organizations like the Sierra Club used NEPA to start, to spur their environmental agenda, and they called it like environmental activism. Um, so the litigation was often about what level of standard, what review a court can and should make of agency decisions, and then also that issue of standing that I talked about in a second ago, and we will talk about later on in this lecture. So 1980s, the clean air, clean water, we're starting to deal with toxic waste a lot. And then people started thinking about not just, okay, we have to, there's pollution and there's litter and there's, toxic waste, but how come a lot of this happens in poor areas or areas where people of color live? So people started thinking about environmental justice. Okay, was and I think we talk about this in our fourth week. Are the decisions to where they put factories racially based? So um, was it racially based, economically based? The residents were misinformed or not informed that these things were going to be happening. So that that kind of the first exploration of those issues happened. Also, our environmental activism grew here. There was a late 70s book by a man named Edward Abbey called The Monkey Wrench Gang. And it's a novel, but they talked about using sabotage to protest environmentally unfriendly activities. So we still use that, right? Put a monkey wrench in it. If you're trying to get any sabotage, anything to kind of make something harder than it should be. Um, so Earth First was also inspired by the Monkey Wrench Gang, like in real life, which is a radical environmental organization, and then Greenpeace. Greenpeace, kind of merged the sabotage with nonviolence, and this is their from their website, uses nonviolent creative action to pave the way towards a greener, more peaceful world. So one of the big things that Greenpeace did was it has their own little boats that were when the Japanese whaling boats were trying to catch whales. They would just get in the way of them so that they couldn't fish effectively. So, without there's no guns or sabotage, but they just got in the way. So that's kind of like what, the 1980s was. Think of, the concepts of environmental justice and starts of environmental activism. Um, and in 1990s, it became a little more politicized. Everybody kind of like, oh, are you an environmentalist? You're not an environmentalist. Ralph Nader was big with his Green Party. And then people started thinking, yeah, I care about the environment. I'm an environmentalist. And, recycling, all those things got kind of big and mandatory in the 1990s. Now, 2000, so in the beginning at the turn of the century and to the 2010s, climate change, global warming, eco-terrorism, people started being more concerned with that. 2010 to now, we're really continuing to be concerned with climate change. A lot of Congress has proposed a lot of laws to deal with it. None have passed. EPA has been unsuccessful in regulating greenhouse gases. It's become a more global effort. with the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and then even just, I think it was last year, we're having UN summits and things like that, where the countries are trying to aim for zero emissions. Just in the news recently was how NATO countries are going to assist other countries to reduce their emissions because they don't have the infrastructure and resources to build greener factories. So we're living in a world where our Congress is ineffectual. People can't really make a lot of decisions. It's like with the president's party is not in the majority, so everybody's at opposite ends. So it's like it happened when Trump was president. What he wanted to do in his second term was counteracted by not having a majority in Congress, and now same thing under Biden's administration. So environmentals are like, well, the EPA is not doing it, we're going back to the courts. So that's kind of what's happening now. The other thing that happens now, since Congress can't do anything, is we are operating a lot under executive order. So when Donald Trump was president, he had a lot of executive orders about the environment. He really the environment was not his priority. He was, I think it was like a year in office before he even named a chairperson of the EPA. He dropped out of the Paris Agreement. So Biden is a self-proclaimed environmentalist, and that's how he considers himself. He rejoined the Paris Agreement. He basically, once he became president, had by executive order reversed all of Donald Trump's executive orders. So he has, I attach these to the module as well. Review of agency activity so he kind of said, like, all right, we got to look at what the EPA did during the prior administration to see what we need to do about the environmental impact of that. January 27th. So again, this is right when he was first entered office. He has an executive order saying the climate should be at the center of the U.S. policy. He went to he's been going to the climate change conferences and working on ways. The goal is zero emissions. He created a climate control office in May, where prior administrations called climate change a myth. So yeah, he's got a net zero goal, and then maybe he's failed. There's been when I was reviewing the articles recently, but one of the ways he's, I think, succeeded is that his whole infrastructure legislation is really tying subsidies and the carrot. If companies build clean and use clean energy, they're going to be rewarded, and there's going to be a lot of jobs and things, like, I don't know, windmills or big wind energy, and solar, a lot of subsidies and things like that. So again, those executive orders are there in the module for you to look at too, once we kind of get through our little history section, which I think is actually right now. So yeah, while I pause this, I would go back to the module. I tried to clean it up a little bit. There are, I have a link for supplemental materials. So things that are supplemental materials here are the executive orders. Oh, go back and watch the Crying Indian video, and take a look at the Silent Spring. Okay, and when you're done with that, come back and watch lecture number 2.